All right, folks, welcome back to Mike and Maurice's Mind Escape. We have episode number 42 today.
Yo,
Uh,
yo.
we're going to be talking about DMT and dreams with Lee Adams. And check out his website, Taileaters.com. And he's also on Facebook. He's got a group on there. I'm on it. It's pretty cool. Yeah, check us out on Patreon, patreon.com/ Mike and Maurice. And check our website out, Mike and Maurice mindescape.com.
Save the plugs for the end, bro. Come
Without
on.
further ado, we've got our buddy Lee Adams here. What's going on, Lee?
Hey, how's it going, guys? Glad to be back. I know
Thanks.
we had a good conversation last time, so
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
So you and I were talking a little back and forth on your group on Facebook, and we both just read that book, which is the latest from Dr. Rick Strassman, the DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. What was your take on that? Because it was kind of a divergent opinion of his from the initial one, which was more, I guess, geared towards appeasing academia, and this one kind of is geared towards his own personal experiences and where he would like to take it, I guess.
yeah. So a little bit of a background on who Dr. Strassman is. He's primarily, I mean, he was raised Jewish, so that's kind of his background, and your childhood belief systems and how you're raised kind of are a foundation of who you are, I think. So he always kind of had that in the background. But then he went and he studied Buddhism with, I think, Tibetan Buddhism, and really got into that because it provided him, like in the 60s, a lot of people get driven to that once they have, certain experiences. And he doesn't really discuss his like personal experiences, if he used any substances or anything, but he definitely had, like meditation experiences and existential crises that typically people have at, younger ages in the 60s and stuff. So, he went that direction. So, when he was writing his first book and having those experiences, or doing the study, primarily, he used the Buddhist and the Tibetan Buddhism ideas for grading his patients' experiences. So then he had, while these people were describing their experiences to him, he noticed that often they weren't having these Buddhist experiences that typically come from like meditation, things like that, where it's this idea that you become one with the universe and things like that. Typically, people were having dualist type of things happen to them. They were experiencing entities. They generally didn't become one with the universe, which is like the non-dualist view of reality where everything is one, things like that. And they weren't having that experience from DMT. Not saying that it doesn't happen. Primarily like 5-MeO DMT, people describe oneness with the universe, things like that. But his patients that he's studying were not having those type of experiences very often. And so it kind of threw him for a loop. He was like, what, this is how I was going to grade it. It's not working. This model's not working. But then he kind of went back to his childhood views of religious experiences, and he remembered that through the Jewish experiences and the Hebrew writings, that people were describing something that was very closely resembling the DMT experience. So his newest book was pretty much taking the prophecy, which a lot of people don't understand. Prophecy means like having an experience, a religious type of experience or a spiritual experience is a form of prophecy, not determining the future, things like that. Just having
people
an experience.
think like Nostradamus kind of.
Yeah.
I realized when you just even mentioned that, I agree with you absolutely, where it's just like a mystical experience that gives you some sort of insight or maybe the ability to kind of like look through the veil or whatever. And when you say that to people, it's kind of like the word occult. People just like flip out, oh, it means demonic or evil or whatever, so it's kind of re-educating people on the different terminology and jargon. I've realized that kind of gets them back into the things.
Didn't Nostradamus predict shit though?
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean he did, but like I mean some of it doesn't hit either. You know, you got Baba Vanga, the old lady from Bulgaria who was predicting shit, you know, and some of these people are accurate, but it's like, is it pareidolia where you're like you're looking for a pattern or you're looking for something, so you're like, oh, this connects, this connects, this connects, or is there something actually there? You know, I mean that's
Right.
my take on. I'm not so sold on Nostradamus. I'm not saying that he wasn't, you know, able to
Yeah,
do
man.
things or whatever, but I'm not like sold on what he was doing, you know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, you're right. The idea of prophecy is generally, I mean, language is important in culture, and using correct language is super important. And generally today we kind of just throw language around, don't really like narrow it down to actually what it means.
Right.
So he spends a lot of time in his book kind of working on language, and because he wants to re-educate people on the importance of these words. So like prophecy doesn't mean like fortune telling or anything like that. It includes that people can prophesize the future, but prophecy in general is like having a spiritual experience that generally like is experienced from some type of like heavenly or godlike or demonic experience, something like that, that gives you some type of insight like you were talking about. So he spends a lot of time in his book talking about that. But the basics of it is that um, he says that pretty much these experiences that people had aren't necessarily determined by hallucinogens or anything like that either. That there's not a lot of evidence to say that these mystical experiences in the Hebrew Bible were brought on by using substances, but he's showing the relationship and also positive relationship and the negative relationship between the DMT experiences from his patients to the Hebrew experience of prophecy. So that's kind of where it is.
His theory though is more of like some sort of endogenous DMT dump, right? Like maybe I was thinking about when I was reading it, like you think of, you know, wandering the desert for 40 days, 40 nights. Well, that would put a severe strain on you, your physical body, and maybe your body went into like a mode where it was, you know, thought it was dying, and all of a sudden you're having these, you know, releases. I don't know. That's just what I was kind of thinking about when I was
Yeah,
reading that. And he kind of alludes to it in certain spots too, you know.
I would. I don't necessarily say that he agrees with that either.
Right.
That these experiences, from his description and talking with him, he pretty much says that it's kind of spontaneous too, where certain people are kind of selected. I mean, you get into the more of the mystical way, you know, the woo-woo kind of stuff in there. But you know, Dr. Strassman's a pretty respectful scientist in my view on
Right.
this stuff. But and he tends to believe or think that there's some type of divine activity taking place where, in a sense, God is like selecting people to have these experiences kind of spontaneous, even if they don't want to or they're not doing something in order to cause it. But yes, there are religious experiences that happen through like heavy breathing, you know, chanting for long periods of time, fasting for long periods of time. And he doesn't deny that that's like a possibility or that does happen. It does happen. But these more like impactful, long lasting experiences that in changing of society experiences that are described in the Hebrew Bible are generally brought on by um, something that's kind of random. It almost seems random, where it just happens to be that person, and they're selected by God or the divine or whatever, and then it happens to them. Versus like them trying to cause it to happen. Even in some cases, people don't want these things to happen. They're like, choose somebody else, like Moses. He's like, choose anybody else but me, and God's like, no, you're it. That's how it's going to be.
So do you think it's like you said, you think it's, or he thinks it's random, but do you think it has some sort of to do with like maybe like a bloodline stuff? Maybe, you know, a lot of these biblical figures, it was like a father and then the son too, and some of these people having similar experiences, and then kind of like a carrying on of tradition, if you will. Do you think it was something like that, or do you really think it was a random thing? Like, oh, this guy's somewhat of an enlightened being, or I'm going to use this guy to do this as not like a pawn, but just kind of nudging
Yeah.
somebody a certain direction, if you will.
I'd say it's too hard to tell because, I mean, we're looking at something that's thousands of years old. We're looking at people that, a book that has been edited, by
Yeah, we
different
don't know a lot
cultures.
about these people either. That's the
Right.
thing, is like there's no context for, besides the parables and the stories and the
Right.
different stuff. So
Like if it happened today to somebody, then we could kind of figure out who that person was, what they're doing, and then kind of justify like, oh, this is probably why they had that experience. Like they're spending a lot of time fasting, or they're very religious in the first place, and they spend a lot of time praying and things like that that could alter their consciousness, or their cultural beliefs are based off of they're super religious or something like that, or maybe they're in psychosis, or they're taking medication, they're eating certain plants, those kind of things. But back then, there's just too much to weed through in order to make some type of image that's like accurate. It's completely ungrounded experiences. You can only take their experience, and if you believe that their experience is real, then you can kind of pick the experience apart to indicate that maybe they're asleep. A lot of it's in people having sleep experiences. They're dreaming. They probably are having what we would consider an out of body experience, where they're in sleep paralysis kind of thing. So, and that we can apply to people today that have those experiences and say, okay, those sounds and stuff like that are similar. So obviously they're having that type of experience or something related to that. But it's the Hebrew Bible. It's super complex and hard to even understand like the internal meaning of it. So that, I mean, and he oddly enough, like his entire goal now is he's kind of in like retirement mode. He's not really like into the psychedelic community or anything like that anymore. He does like help people and editing their peer reviewed papers and stuff that deal with DMT and like altered states. But primarily he's spending his time focusing on the Hebrew Bible and like interpreting it, trying to get into a way of to the masses, to try to like explain the language inside of it, so that people can actually understand that like this isn't just like some crazy thought process that these people are having and wrote it down in the Bible. It's actually like there's actually information in there that's really important to culture and human experience, and that's where he's trying to go with it. And it's not like some like crazy person doing this. It's like he's a legitimate person. He's grounded, and he understands the complication that's involved with the Bible, and he wants to make it so it's not so complicated, so people can actually understand that like there's important information in it.
yeah, I mean, I definitely got that vibe. And actually I watched his Magical Egypt Symposium, and he talked a little bit about the beginning, how he's gone to like different places to try and talk about it. Like I think he just talked about a place in like California where he tried to talk about it. They're like, you can't talk about that here. It's like religion or whatever. And they didn't really understand that there was like a greater context or a greater, it's not just about like, he's just trying to give a model of a possibility of what these people were experiencing in a real scientific, I guess semi-scientific way. And I think that, obviously there's people that are just hearing the one thing and not really kind of picking up on the other thing. So
he got kicked out of TED Talks because of it.
So what's he's trying to connect DMT to religion and the Hebrew Bible, or
more like explain the religious experience in the Hebrew Bible. So like it's really complex because I mean, for me, I was very religious as a kid, and when I started reading his book, I found a lot of anxiety coming out. Actually, I was like kind of getting upset that was forced to read this book. Not like forced to, but I was really wanting to read this book because I was going to talk to him, and it put me off. I was like, I don't want to read this because I had so many biases towards the Bible that I was like, I didn't want to even look at it. But when I started reading his book, he really goes into the words, like I was saying, like the actual information in it and the words that are involved. And and picks them apart and shows that like the Hebrew language is very complex and it has a lot of information in each word that you can't just take on and say, oh, that's what it means. You have to really like dig down deep into it. So like one thing that he described was this idea of God. And like in my mindset, you know, the idea of God in a Jewish perspective or a Christian perspective is that he's like some old guys, you know,
Yeah,
like in a
sitting in the chair in the sky.
yeah, exactly.
Basically Zeus is what you're
Yeah.
picturing.
Exactly. Even, you know, and it's important to reference Greek mythology too in a second. But what they were really describing is like this thing that you can't imagine, you can't possibly really even relate to. It's so powerful that it's beyond human consciousness. You can't even begin to understand it. So it's like a fourth dimensional object. You just can't describe it. It's completely out of your grasp of consciousness. It's just beyond us. So how do you talk about something like that? You know, it may exist, but you can't talk about it. The only way that you can talk about it is if you really dumb it down to a point where people can like relate to that object. So the Hebrews' way of relating to God is to make him into a figure of that was relatable to their culture. So they created this man, you know, God is not man or woman to Hebrews, but they have to describe it. So they described it as a man, and they described it in a way that had, you know, human like attributes to it. It got emotional and things like that. And that was the way they described it. So like Greek mythology is also the same way. It's the mythology. It doesn't mean that it's myth doesn't mean fake. It means like it's a story that relates to humans and their culture and their consciousness. So they used myth, and Zeus is, you know, it's a good figure. It's a figure of this divine being as well. But they're not describing. They don't believe that there's people in the sky, you know, that are Zeus and all these gods and stuff like that doing this stuff like that we imagine they're like that. What they're really describing is something beyond that, but they're dumbing it down to the point that they can actually communicate it. And, you know, cultures have been doing that forever. Like Native Americans have creation stories where, you know, like the fox and the wolf and all this stuff. And you're like, how can this culture believe that like some wolf or fox is making the universe? This is stupid. You know, like how immature or, you know, whatever, stupid of them. Right. But really they know that that's not, the fox didn't make the universe, but they're dumbing it down so that they can relate to their culture and they can talk about it and have stories. So that's the mythology behind it. So the Hebrews Bible has a lot of mythology in it. Doesn't mean it's fake. Myth doesn't mean fake. People, again, use that word to discredit things.
That was like early science was like what you're kind of what you're talking about. Like it's just a way, like how we can describe things by measuring and, you know, redoing different tests and different things to explain something. That was just their way of back then of doing that. Actually, I mean, if you think about it, science is actually still kind of a new
mythology.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it doesn't mean it's fake. Just you're describing something in a way in a story format. So like science is like something I've been getting into is this idea of like polytheism and monotheism. And polytheism is like storytelling. It's a way of thinking of the world as in these stories that change and it evolves over time. And, you know, characters are described as they're describing things of the psyche and things like that that aren't necessarily like super hard forms. You know, there's different aspects of right and wrong and things like that. And it changes and it's morphed. And then there's monotheism, which is absolutes, rights and wrongs. So science generally is a monotheistic view of reality where something is true and then there's something that's false. And Christianity is actually more of a monotheistic view on religious experience where there's God and then there's Satan and then there's heaven and there's hell and there's right and there's wrong and things like that. And both are actually like the more you understand the polytheism and the monotheism, there's no one way to look at reality. Both of them are actually just as important to understand together. It's like the creative aspect to the more logical aspect too. Those are monotheistic and polytheistic, and using those together to create your actual form of reality is what is true potential of human existence, like understanding of reality. You can't, if you exclude one from the other, then you're missing half the picture. So yeah, so one is that they're both equally as important, but at the same time, they're equally unimportant.
So do
If that
you
makes any
think
sense.
do you think some of these older cultures were smarter in the sense that they combine science and art kind of into the same thing?
Absolutely.
Well,
Yeah,
that wasn't
absolutely.
that long ago, though. I mean, we're talking for that stuff was like, 14, 15, 16, 1700s. If we think about mythology, I mean, that goes back to BC, thousands of years. And actually, we were just talking about monotheism, polytheism. I mean, Akhenaten was father of monotheism, the first recorded person to say, no, 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 there's one God. And that's dynastic Egypt. So, I think what you're talking about is kind of like the scientific revolution where everything was kind of married together, music, art, science, it was kind of like an all encompassing thing. You see your Renaissance men, your Da Vinci's, and, all that kind of stuff too. Bless you.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
But let's correlate this now to dreams, because part of that book does talk about how he believes that a lot of these prophets were actually sleeping
Definitely.
during some of these experiences. So what was your take on that? Was that they're having lucid dreams maybe, and that was what was actually happening? Or were they stuck, kind of what you were saying, they were picked and having this experience, but while they were sleeping? Or what was your...
Well, before even reading that in his book, there's a great article out there. I forget the name of it, but I can send it to you. I think it's called like I can't remember the name of it, but anyways, I'll describe it. So it's this article that talks about the dream experience, and then it relates it to the prophecy experience pretty much. And they're talking about certain sounds and sensations that people have during their dream experiences that relate to the Hebrew Bible again, and other prophetic type of experience. And like ringing of bells, like angels usually come after ringing of bells, or the sound of trumpets, or singing, or...
Let me stop you right there. I've done we've interviewed a lot of people now that have, like the one guy that we interviewed, Dick Kahn, who wrote a book about, he's done it 600 times in the last few years. He talks about this ringing. You can feel or hear this ringing when you're about to go under. Do you correlate those two things together? Like kind of what you're saying, these bells or these trumpets, is that sensation? That I've never done it, but I've interviewed enough people to know that that's a commonality when people describe the experience.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we may describe them as different today too. So like often people hear radio, it sounds like radio chatter kind of. And so people today may describe that as, a radio. But then you take it back a couple thousand years where radio didn't exist, and people may think that that sounds like ringing of bells or angels speaking, So you have to really understand that like this is a different time, and these people saw reality as completely different than we do today, and their relationship to those experiences are going to be different in their descriptions. So, but yes, like often people that, if you read about sleep paralysis and their experiences in sleep paralysis, they often describe sounds very closely resembling prophetic states, like 100%. Even, they're not intending to have these sounds happen to them, and they may be religious, they may not be religious, but it's common throughout like all cultures that they have these sounds. Definitely like trains sounds like a train's coming, very loud, vibrational experiences that can be auditory or felt. Breath, the blowing of wind is often describes God and him communicating to people. And definitely there's an astral wind that people experience, and out of body experiences, as well as like hearing wind blowing in their ears. My first sleep paralysis was experienced with somebody blowing in directly into my ear. It felt like somebody was blowing. So I thought it was my buddy blowing into my ear, and it was just really pissing me off. I
Probably
think I
better.
told you about it
Probably
before.
better it wasn't him blowing. your-
Yeah, he was gonna get.
Well, I was gonna say, man, you're describing my Saturday night with my girlfriend, man.
Yeah, well, I lived in a house that I had a couple of roommates that were staying with me, and one of them was definitely a joker. You know, the kind of guy that would jump on you in the middle of the night and start hitting you or something. Or so I assumed that it was him, and he would have a bloody nose today. You know, at that time, if it was him, because I swung around to hit him because I was so upset. And it's pretty annoying, you know, somebody blowing in your ear and you can't move. I thought he was like just had me in a headlock, and then you know, and then I woke up when I moved and there was nobody in my room, so that was sleep paralysis. And if you read like Robert Monroe's book Journeys Out of the Body, he actually describes being able to go in and out of his body at this point where he hears wind blowing in his ear. He feels like somebody's blowing into his ear, just like I did. And I read this years later. Like I read this last year, and I had sleep paralysis in like 2006. And he said it frightened him, this thing blowing in his ear, and he was able to move out of his body into out of body state while this was happening, and he'd blow, and then he would feel the sensation of air blowing into his ear as he was blowing in his astral body. And so like he, through this, doing this multiple times, he found out that it was actually him blowing into his own ear, like in a weird state. You know, his consciousness is divided in between two states of consciousness. And
Badass.
yeah, and he was like, I was scaring myself, you know, and I was like, maybe I was doing that too, you know, and I assumed that it was somebody else in my room, you know, but you know, thinking about it, I'm like, yeah, that was probably me. So
Dude, that's crazy. Have you seen that new show? It's called like Haunting in Hill House. It's on
oh yeah,
Netflix.
yeah.
Have you seen all that?
Yes, yeah.
Because there's
It's
like
pretty good.
Isn't that kind of what happens to that girl? I don't want to spoil
Yeah.
it for Maisie.
They
Fucking weird.
definitely had sleep
Spoil, bro.
paralysis.
You
It was definitely
spoiled
sleep
it.
paralysis.
I
Yeah.
spoil it up, man. I spoil.
But yeah, we talked about sleep paralysis last time, and I
Nice.
remember you had some kind of scary experiences with it until you kind of confronted it.
Yeah.
But this seems to be a little different in the sense that almost like the one thing is fear based, although you can control it if you realize it. It sounds like. Where the DMT thing kind of just takes you over and kind of just flushes over you. From what I've read, it's almost like you don't really have control of what's going on at all.
Yeah. Like if you take DMT, definitely. But if you're having a sleep experience and let's just say that DMT is the cause of your mystical experiences in sleep too. You know, I'm not saying it's
Well, we had a discussion about that too. You thought it might be
Yeah.
this other thing too, kappa opioid, which
Yeah.
is the salvia derivative.
I mean, you know, it could be that too. It doesn't really matter because if you call it DMT or you call it salvia, your nicotinic receptors in the brain, you know, activating, then you know, regardless of whatever it is, the experience is happening. So then you're like, okay, well, what is that? You know, that experience. So like for somebody that resists sleep paralysis, you know, they are fear-driven type people or something like that, and they have this experience and it's fearful. They may resist it and then have traumatic experiences in there, like extreme vibrations or hallucinatory experiences that are traumatic and weird as hell and just freak them out, right? Because it's completely fear-driven at that point. Well, if you have somebody that isn't driven by fear, you know, maybe thousands of years ago, even people probably weren't, you know, they slept outside and things like that, and maybe they were less fear-driven, or maybe they're very religious or something like that, and firm in their beliefs and stuff like that. Who knows? But maybe they're more open to these experiences of nature too, and they have sleep paralysis. Well, it may not be as traumatizing to them. They may just accept it happening and then move on. You know, they may be more willing to move on. So then it would just take them over and they would have that experience versus like a resistance and a traumatizing vibrational experience that generally people talk about today when they have sleep paralysis. So, you know, and if you take DMT from what Strassman was talking about, inject it into you, then it takes over you. You have no choice really in the matter. But people did describe, some of them did describe like violent vibrations and stuff like that as well.
Is
As
that the most potent form to take it, or was, because from what I've watched, it looks like people that smoke 5-MeO kind of go into a way more nuts thing than I've seen other people doing different stuff like ayahuasca, or I mean, they don't really show you injecting it necessarily in the spirit molecule, so it's hard to see how these people are actually reacting. But
well, he had experienced people that had used DMT before and they smoked it in his group, and so he used one of those people as like a model for trying the injection, and they responded saying that that was the most accurate to smoking it, and they couldn't smoke it because of obvious reasons to that, so that's why they went with the injection. It's safer and it's more controllable.
right.
So but they said that that was comparable. I've never smoked DMT or injected it into me, so I don't know what that would be like.
Right.
So,
Well, it seems like any drug, it gets into your blood faster if you smoke crack or if you shoot or smoke heroin.
yeah,
Ding.
definitely.
Two great examples right there.
You inject it into your muscles, you know, with an IV and stuff, you'd probably have similar experiences. It probably very quickly into your brain where it needs to get going and does some stuff. So
Do you think, I know we've gone back and forth about this, but do you think that DMT, like based on any recent research, because I know when we talked a couple months ago, you were pretty on the path of finding out for yourself or your own truth that DMT is not as responsible for a lot of these dream states, lucid dreams, that kind of stuff. And it's more, like you said, kappa opioid or some other sort of neuron thing that's happening, or possibly some other sort of endogenous chemical that's being released in our brain. Or
yeah, I mean, I sent you that video, and I'll just it's pretty technical, so I didn't understand everything in there, but you could get the gist of it pretty much in the conclusion.
right.
And the conclusion was that if there is, it's pretty much saying that the pineal gland DMT theory is not possible, pretty much based on like logical reasoning.
Right.
There's just not enough produced in the pineal gland to cause people to have mystical experiences. It's just, even if you know, even they've only found it in rat brains, because obviously it's harder to do studies on human brains.
Well, you have to tap into an alive person, which, I mean, who's going to allow that, you know?
Yeah. And
but it is produced in our liver and our lungs, isn't it?
right. So I mean, it is produced in other areas of the brain or body, and you know, you may produce enough if you were breathing heavily and things like that to cause an experience. But I mean, you can have runner's high and things like that. You can run hard and breathe heavily and still not have like psychedelic experiences from that. So it was, the conclusion was pretty much that there's just not enough really in the human system, like at sleep time, to justify it being the molecule that's causing people to have mystical experiences in sleep or dreams. So if there was an alternative to that, then that was, you know, the simplest answer is probably the right one, and Occam's razor or whatever, right? And this guy was justifying that there is a chemical that is active in the brain. It's very reasonable that this is what's causing it. Other psychedelics that resemble that chemical, such as salvia, ibogaine, and ketamine, all have the same type of experience that are directly correspond to out-of-body experiences. So
dissociative psychedelics, right?
Yeah, so they mimic having an out-of-body experience, and they often cause out-of-body experiences exactly how an out-of-body experience is. And you know, you look at that and you look at the evidence that it's in the body, it reacts to the brain very well, just like DMT does. It's most likely going to be that. So pretty much that. I mean, I was on the DMT train for a long time, probably like 9 years or something like that.
Right.
There were articles about it saying, oh, these chemical processes, they could possibly get to that point, and followed Strassman's work very closely. But after a lot of review, I'm like, yeah, it's okay. This totally makes sense. So you kind of you gotta go, you can't be stuck on a train going the wrong direction. You gotta eventually get off and be like, okay, yeah, maybe this other one is right.
Let me ask you a question though. So you say there's not enough based on what they can detect or whatever. Do you think it's possible our body can synthesize it in mass amounts at some point, given some sort of on-off switch? Or, like, I mean, our brain's super powerful. We obviously release different things in our bodies at different times, whether you're sick and your cells, change or whatever to go combat the disease, something like that. Do you think that's a possibility for something like that? I'm not a biologist, obviously. I don't know the chemical process or, makeup of that, but do you think it's possible to create that if in certain instances, or no? Is that not what's happening?
Anything's possible, really. I think, you may be able to just disassociate yourself just from an idea or a memory too. You don't necessarily have to take a drug, or there may be no chemical reasoning to it. You're just
Right.
you just have a memory, and that is enough to cause you to have a psychotic break. It doesn't have to necessarily be a chemical reason behind it. I mean, your brain is chemical, electrical, but so some chemicals are interacting there, but it's not the, you don't have to blame the chemical for the psychosis. But I think it's unlikely that DMT is the one causing that. But sure, it could do that, but it's more likely that it's some other type of interaction taking place that's causing people to dream and stuff.
So that's the distinguishment between dreaming and kind of what's going on in this book, DMT and the Soul Prophecy, is the fact that, like you said before, these people are getting picked for these experiences, whether they're in a dream state or about to dream or wide awake. It doesn't matter. It's still the same experience happening to that person. Is that kind of what his philosophy then was towards that, knowing what we know and what we just talked about?
It was really hard to figure out like what his whole his whole view was through the book, and also after talking to him, I didn't get any clear answers to this. Him hypothesizing that DMT is causing mystical states. That was not the hypothesis in his book, and he never even mentioned anything close to that when we were talking. It was pretty much that he was relating the DMT experience to this prophetic state and showing the similarities of that experience, and then that's it. He wasn't saying like prophecy is caused by DMT or DMT produces prophecies. He's just saying that they resemble each other. And I even tried to see what his view was of the DMT state. Was it equivalent to the prophetic state? Like, is there something to be gained from this experience at all? And he completely went away from that. He was like, I got the gist that he didn't think that the DMT experience was a prophetic state or experience.
Right.
And so what I got from all that is that he was just relating the two together, and he saw some similarities, and he was describing those similarities, but there wasn't like any giant realization through that.
Do you think he doesn't want to say that stuff because he doesn't want to be fucking skewered by people?
No, because he's been skewered multiple times. So the Buddhist community, his community that he spent many years on working with, ostracized them when he started doing the DMT experiments and releasing papers describing these experiences, and then TED Talks and stuff like
You'd
that.
think the Buddhists would be more.
I know, man. They're
open-minded
not
towards this
practicing
kind
what
of
they
stuff.
preach. What the fuck?
Yeah. Well, primarily they're saying they don't. I mean, like most religious communities don't want people to take a substance and then have an experience. because they kind of want to hold on to it's looked down upon because they think it's cheating for one, and they generally want to hoard the knowledge, it's a kind of ego, you're like, I'm control, you come to me and I teach you, that's how it works. So if you have somebody that can go take a pill or something like that and have some type of mystical experience that changes them so dramatically that they just, they want to tell everyone about it, and they feel they have had a religious experience, then that kind of takes the power away from that. And also it's important to have guidance, and groundedness when you have experiences like that, because it can turn you into the next Manson, where you think that helter skelter is going to happen and you go murder people because you think you're the next prophet or something like that, or Jesus. So it's like, that's important too. So I think there's fear of the loss of control of information and control over people, and also the fear of the loss of control over the experience and having people just run around crazy and in psychosis or whatever, thinking they're Jesus. And so that's scary. But I mean, a lot of these cultures and religious groups have used psychedelics in the past, and they wrote about them. There's historical evidence that Buddhists were using mushrooms, and they'll deny it to the end, but there's people that have written about it. There's people that have talked about it. There's evidence. I mean, there's Buddhists that have at the time period wrote about them using mushrooms. Hindus use soma. Yeah, use soma. And
there's a famous story where Terrence McKenna gives a Tibetan Buddhist like some DMT or something, and the guy
and a black light poster.
This guy goes into a world and comes back and is like, "That's the farthest you can go," into the death realm and still come back.
Wow.
So like, obviously, I think if you gave that to somebody that was an enlightened being, they would have some sort of insight on it that you might not get from a normal person doing it, because they've kind of achieved that state without it, so.
Right. Yeah. I mean, well, there's a lot to be learned from the good work, right, of going into that state through practice. There's something to be said about that. So if you sit there and you meditate every day for the next 30 years, and eventually you get to the point where you can have that experience, there's a lot of learning and life lesson that's involved in that, versus somebody that just goes there. The journey is actually the experience, not the end result. So that's where the teaching comes from, I think, not the actual experience at the end. So so that's important, to remember. I was going to say too that it's odd that Middle Easterns use Syrian rue as a sacrament to like bless people and stuff. And Syrian rue by itself, I believe, is partially has some DMT in it and as a strong MAOI. So you would imagine that somebody's probably stuck that in their mouth, over thousands of years and had some type of experience in there. And why this herb or seed is used as a blessing, And it's odd that the Catholics kind of they bless people with, burning incenses and stuff like that too.
Right.
Like, why are you burning it? Why are you blowing this smoke all over people? What does that have to do? So, it's just people forgetting about where they kind of come from, with those things.
Yeah.
So,
well, I know Hamilton Morris was on Joe Rogan a few months ago, and because Joe Rogan was like, "What about Moses and the burning bush? Could the burning bush been an acacia bush that caused him to hallucinate?" And Hamilton Morris said, "There's no way, because you would just need so much of that, to kind of kick that experience into gear. It's not, obviously the extract will do that to you, but when you start dealing with like, it would be probably like taking a dab versus taking a hit of some shitty weed. Like there's a whole world of difference there. So
it's a concentrate.
Yeah,
I think people look at that as too. They take that story and they use it too literally too. I mean, who's to say that Moses wasn't making the plant into a drink of some kind, and it spoke to him, and he called it the burning bush because he saw fire, or something like that in his an experience, and so he just called it the burning bush, and it kept talking to him over time, you know.
Right.
But really, he describes a brew versus an actual bush that he found out, you know, in the desert someplace on fire, you know.
That's
So
a good
I mean,
point. Yeah.
people just take this stuff way too literally, and they don't, you know, understand. I mean, it's impossible to, but use, you know, people need to use a little bit of creativity
Well, I
and
know the
figure it
acacia
out.
in the Middle East that there's like some bushes that have up to like 2%, which is actually like a high percentage. And I know actually the Egyptians, if you look at a lot of their stuff, a lot of their stuff's acacia based, and you go anywhere in Egypt, it's acacia trees, acacia bushes, you know, all that kind of stuff. So I know they were more focused on like the blue lotus and that kind of stuff. But
Yeah.
who's to say? I mean, there's only a certain amount of glyphs. They can't write everything down. So
Yeah, definitely.
but yeah, what as far as your research with I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this because this is hits home with me, like using some of this stuff to heal. You know, I know you've had your experiences with this stuff. I've had mine, you know, I have OCD or had OCD. I guess I still have it, but it's not necessarily an active, you know,
Yeah.
thing right now. But I think for me, I had a realization that OCD is all about control. And
Yeah.
once you have one of these experiences, you lose that control. So it's like almost like a thing. It's showing you, hey, you can lose control of the situation and everything will still end up all right. And it might even give you some insight while that's happening on why that's the case, you know?
Yeah,
man.
it's the Winnie the Pooh shit. You know, just let it happen. It'll
I
be
don't
all
get
right
that
in the end.
reference, but yeah, man. What do you mean by Winnie the Pooh? Yeah, go ahead.
Like if you watch the show Winnie the Pooh, they wrote a book, The Tao of Pooh, and
Yeah.
it like relates Taoism to Winnie the Pooh. But
okay.
essentially, it's just he would wander out into the fog and you know, he'd find his way home. Whatever problem he entered, he just wouldn't worry, and eventually it would end up all right. And he's surrounded by, you know, like the owl who's super smart and overthinks things, or rabbit who, you know, works himself too hard. They always seem to have more issues than Winnie, who,
Oh
you
yeah,
know,
he just
kind
goes
of up
with
to
it.
exactly.
What's
So
there's an Eeyore book too. What's that one called? The
Depression's awesome. I'm just kidding.
no, it's like the Tao of Pooh and the something of Eeyore. I forget, but yeah,
yeah, it was the follow up to the book. But yeah, we always call people that are depressed Eeyores.
Yeah,
It's
I've been
that
called Eeyore many times.
that name Eeyore just fits the fits the mold, man.
yeah. But
Yeah.
I think I do think that there is something to that, the loss of control of the situation,
Oh, yeah.
and then being forced to experience something that you don't want to face could be way more therapeutically cleansing than, let's say, going to 20 sessions with a doctor or whatever, you know. Or and
Yeah.
I've been through CBD therapy and I've taken all the pills. None of that shit helped me personally. I know it
Right,
helps a lot of
depends on the
people.
person.
If you know, if you're taking something that helps you, stick with it. But there is alternatives out there for people that feel like nothing's happening and they're doing what they're told, you know. So.
Yeah. So I mean, I think psychedelics do a lot of things, which makes sense because they are. And generally, I think the overall way of describing it is that it's a communication error in the brain, where it's allowing the brain to communicate to itself. Say the left and the right hemispheres better. Maybe something to do with like the corpus callosum. I can never say that right, but the building better communication in between the hemispheres is definitely like something that's important there. So then you can become, for people that generally use psychedelics, come up with some, you know, ideas from that. They're like, wow, I never really thought of it that way. Or I've often found myself when I have psychedelics or something, I think of something in a way that makes sense to me, and I may have thought of it before, but for some reason I never really thought of it the same way. You know, like it's not something new that's generated usually. It's just like for some reason now I'm seeing something that was in front of me, and
It's
I'm
like a
seeing,
clearer thought without all the
Yeah.
bullshit in the background, kind
I'm like,
of.
wow, like,
Yeah.
you know, I can't believe I didn't think of that before, you know, and it seems so amazing to me, but at the same time I'm like, yeah, it was there the whole time. But so that is happening, but at the same time I think you're on to something profound, and I don't think it's just a psychedelic experience that causes those. I think I've been reading a lot of Joseph Calloway, or Joseph Campbell, sorry, hero's journey stuff, and really researching that and writing about it in dreams and my dream work. And I've related my dream experiences into, and also psychedelic experiences into, this hero's journey that's taking place in my life. And it actually mimics it like exactly in the description. And what I think that journey is for each person is actually a realization of the loss of control. We generally want to control everything. So like even lucid dreaming, like I used to be a huge supporter of lucid dreaming and trying to control your dreams and do things in them. What I've realized is that that is also an egotistical driven desire to control all aspects of your life, even the most creative aspect possible, which is dreaming. So we want to dive in there and we want to create our own world and like our own experiences from it and be like, I'm in control. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to have all my desires met. Well, that's the opposite of what should be happening in the dream state. And eventually, what I've found is dream characters start coming out of the woodwork and start trying to fight back. And that's when things start getting dark and negative, and people start having nightmares. And sleep paralysis too comes from the aspect of control and trying to control the experience. So, but what happens is that once you realize that you can't control everything, you allow things to happen, you eventually start facing your shadow, and you start realizing the shadow is the part of you that wants to have control. And once you can integrate with that shadow aspect of yourself, you realize that control of life, death, happiness, sadness, things like that is just getting in the way of your real progress. And that once you release control over these aspects, then you can move on with your journey. And I think a lot of psychological issues come out of this idea that you can control everything. I mean, like Buddhism, and meditation practices is all about letting go and just letting your mind wander and seeing thoughts as stories and just letting them process and flow out of you, so you can eventually realize that all thoughts are just stories and they don't mean that much. What really is meaningful is your experience through life and flowing with life. That's where the flow of life is, where people are the most happy or most content. Not even happy. Happiness is a control aspect too, trying to always be happy and satisfied with, or not satisfied, but always be happy, right? That's impossible. We all know that. So if you're flowing through life, then you're satisfied. You're not happy, you're not sad, you're just satisfied. You're content with things. And that's what the journey, I think, is all about: living your life in contentment and being satisfied with what you have. And doesn't necessarily mean you don't want more or you strive to do more or whatever. But once you get to that point where you realize that more doesn't mean better, then it kind of changes the definition of what more is. What's more money? What's more happiness?
Right.
What does that mean? So if you're going with the flow of life, you're kind of going with what is meant to be. I don't really believe in predetermination or anything like that, but it seems kind of apply to that. Like when things start going the way they're supposed to go, those are words of using predetermination, and just it works out. Depression, things like that kind of go away. For your question of like how psychedelics has helped me with mental illness, things like that, I was chronically depressed for the majority of my life still. So my depression, I'd say, went away probably when I was 24, 25. And up to that point, like I would contemplate committing suicide many times and just be utterly depressed and destroyed. And that could come from many things in my family, experiences with my dad and interactions with him and, my family or whatever. But when I started taking psychedelics, I definitely had a death experience where I thought I killed myself through DMT. And that was definitely a loss of control and scared me. At the same time, it taught me a lesson of releasing control, right? You can't have control over death. It's just something that's going to happen and take place. And a lot of existential work has to do with the acceptance of death. So anxiety, there's a belief that all anxiety is caused from the fear of death, and I tend to think that is true. So people that are anxious all the time and stuff like that, it really, if you really get down into it, it's because they're going to die someday, and they don't feel like they're doing enough, or they're doing what they should be doing, or that all their work's going to go away.
That's
And
what mine was. My OCD was based on hypochondria, fear of germs, fear of disease, fear of death, you know, all that kind of stuff. So you're absolutely right there. I mean, I had to confront that. And then that was a huge, on top of doing other things like changing diet, meditation,
yeah,
just trying to be a more positive person. Because when you're in that mind state, you're in a very poor me. How come this is happening to me?
yeah,
What did I do to deserve this? You don't know how to
Wah.
get out of that either. Yeah. Well, when you're in it, buddy, you come back to me with that joke and I'll
What
fucking
the fuck,
crush it.
bro? You don't think I've been in some shit?
I'm just saying though, when you're really in the deepest depths of fucking Mordor, dude, that's not
Yeah.
a
I've been in
joke.
some Mordor, bro.
But no, but just my point was that once I was able to confront that on top of doing other things and quitting taking these medicines and CBT, not that those are, like I said, those are great, those help some people, but they weren't helping me, and I knew it, and it had been a long time, so I needed to try something new. But then I had a realization. I'm like, and I saw a quote somewhere. I forget the exact quote and who said it. I'm sure you can look it up, somebody, but it was like, once you realize you're not in control of your life, you can really start living. And that really hit home with me. It's like, I'm not living. I'm just trying to control every aspect of every day, you know, and you just can't do that. It's at some point it's going to wear you the fuck down, and you're going to either have a mental collapse and have to go to the hospital, or worse, you know, like you said,
Yeah.
you contemplated suicide, which is a horrible thing, you know? So, but yeah, the fear of death thing, I think that's huge. And everybody is scared of death, whether you want to admit it or not. You know, you can confront it and come to grips with it, but everybody's scared to die.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I'm still scared of death in some ways,
Fuck
you know.
yeah.
But at the same time, I've gone through all these experiences, especially out of body experiences, have helped me maybe more even than DMT or other psychedelics, because every single time it feels like a dying experience almost. But after having like 30 or 40 of them, you get used to it. You know, you're like, huh, whatever, no big deal. So then the anxiety of that experience starts going away, and then things start going better. And you're like, oh, well, if I don't, if I don't sit there and try to resist this experience, then things flow better and life becomes positive, or the experience itself becomes positive. If you take that same idea into waking reality, then if you no longer resist this, experience that's going to take place one day of dying or death, then you can just you can relax and allow life to happen instead of focusing on this end game, and then you can enjoy life the way it's meant to be as a journey, and it translates 100% one way and the other. So great lessons. Psychedelic experience, same thing.
I wanted to give a shout out to Cosmo on our YouTube page. They're asking, do you know who Tom Campbell is?
Tom Campbell, yeah.
So you are familiar with his work?
Yes, yeah.
Okay,
Big
cool.
Toe guy, right?
Yeah,
I'm
My
not-
Big Toe.
Yeah.
That's the name of his book, My Big Toe.
Yeah. I'm not a huge fan.
We did an episode on him. I like a lot of his ideas. Like, we're all being funneled in through entropy towards this one big consciousness of love. I mean, that's a great idea. And I think, he kind of understands obviously meditation and out of body experiences and stuff like that. For me, and you and I have talked about this, Lee, if you're really going to come up with a theory of everything, and it's a working theory, which he does call his, and he is open to changes and suggestions and stuff like that. I don't think you can be as definitive on certain things knowing what we know about what we know, like the nature of reality. I think that there's so many different things happening all the time, and improvements, and I read his book. There's 3 books actually. and they're great books. I just think that when you don't try psychedelics and you poo-poo them as not being a necessary or at least an interesting aspect to the whole movement of this whole thing, and I get it, he wants to be based in scientific, evidence and based in data and stuff like that. And he's a scientist, and that's great. But I think once you start diminishing other aspects that are so profound that people are having religious, spiritual, whatever experiences, you would be nuts not to at least look at that and entertain that as an idea.
Yeah.
What about Hawking? Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you.
I think all science is based off of a monotheistic view of reality, man. Like if you're a hardcore scientist, then that's the kind of way that you're going to present yourself, is that there's a real thing and then there's a non-real thing, or there's truth and then there's false. And that's just how it is. Like that's how your brain works. It's pure logic, that's great. That fills half of the brain. The other, or consciousness, the other half is the polytheistic view of reality and
gray matter, figuratively and literally.
There's more to it than just the other one half. So I applaud people that are like that. And I'm generally in the past I try to be more scientific than creative, or, more there's a truth and there's a false. But at the same time, what I've realized through all that is that that it got me nowhere. That great, I have some ideas of what's happening, things like that. But really, I'm spending all this energy and time, and everyone else is spending all their energy trying to prove or disprove an experience when the experience exists, And if the experience exists, why not spend 90% of your time having the experience for yourself, this journey that is presented to you in front of you, this amazing, opportunity to practice, contentment and having these amazing out of body experiences, and not forcing, the experience or anything like that, but just being open to it and continuing forward versus spending 90% of your time focusing on if this is real, if it's not real, I know the truth, you don't know, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That's just inflaming the ego even more. So it's spend 10% doing that, or even less if possible. But, sure, spend some time doing that. But the other, percentage, or even do 50-50, right? We're talking about monotheism and polytheism. Do 50-50. Spend 50% of your time trying to prove or disprove, and 50% of your time just having the experience and having it for what it is, So
right.
It seems like scientists like him that's his whole thing, it's
well, I went in, one of our other buddies, Andrew Tischler, who comes on here, told me about him, and I looked into his stuff, watched all the YouTube videos, I started reading his books. It's great stuff. I'm not disputing that it's a possibility or that it's, there's a chance that this is correct. But like I said, I think any smart person, their intelligence is gauged by how malleable they are to new data and observations and stuff like that. And if you're not including everything into that mix, I don't know how that can be considered a theory of everything, because you're not taking into account, whatever you want to call it, plant medicine, entheogens, whatever,
Let's say he's right. Say everything he says is 100% correct, right? And we're all good. All right. What does that do? What does that do for anybody?
Right.
We're still going to die, we're still having these experiences. Okay, now we know some facts about the experience. It's what does that do for you? It doesn't do shit.
That's the Stephen Hawking shit. It's sweet, man. You didn't fuck all for me.
Well, it's I didn't like how that after he died, it's new book says there's no life after death or whatever. It's that's just because he was dying, he was scared. He probably, since you're a scientist, you're a reductionist, and the lights are about to go out, that would be my take from that, but I think we do need people like Tom Campbell, because he does bring people into this element that wouldn't normally be there.
Yeah, we need a bridge between the fucking metaphysical
exactly,
and the
exactly. And even if he's not correct or whatever, he's half correct or whatever, he's open to ideas. Like he talks about like spirits and UFOs and like how they could just be a phenomenon, that we're not understanding, which is a lot of what we think too. I think, like we were talking about dimensions earlier, we're in the third dimension. I know a lot of theoretical physicists think it ends there and just add time as the fourth dimension, and then that's the theory of everything, but we're learning that now that's not the case, and that's wrong, and they're scrambling to figure out what the fuck is really going on. And that's why you see all the psychedelic research and all this stuff happening, because we really still don't know what's going on. We don't even know what consciousness is, so
well, I'm open for change, and so I'm going to change my stance on 90-10. And I'm going to say 50-50. I like that. Spend 50% of your time researching what is real and what's not real. There's your groundedness. And then 50% of your time living your experience, your journey through life, and just going with the flow and doing a practice of some kind. Meditate, whatever. But
I say it's a good mix for sure.
And that fits in the model, monotheistic, polytheistic, 50-50, That's where I think that's the sweet spot. I'll go with that until I'm proved wrong.
That's the honey hole.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's actually wrap it up here.
All right,
Thank you for coming on. Like I said, check out Lee's website, taileaters.com, and check out his podcast on YouTube called Cosmic Echo. He's got some great people on there. He's gonna. Have you put up Rick Strassman yet?
No, it'll be out in probably a couple weeks. And
he did Dennis McKenna about a month ago. That's on there. That's a great interview. I suggest watching that. And yeah, Taileaters is kind of like a website. It's like an Erwids for the soul, kind of. You got all out-of-body experiences. You got psychedelic research. You got all sorts of stuff on there.
Sweet.
But we'll have you on again. I want to get you on here with our other buddy, Chris Emerson, and talk about some lucid dreaming. I know we tried to line it up last time. It didn't work out, but we'll get you guys on together and do some stuff. But I appreciate you coming back on. Man. And
hell yeah, thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. It was great.
No problem.
As always.
We'll do it again soon.
Sounds good, man.
Cheers.
Peace.